This is Professor Matthew Sergi reporting to you on an experiment I've just completed to help me communicate to my students what I mean when I talk about process. I demonstrate what I'm trying to get across, how to rush and stay sincere, by building an essay of my own, of the length I most often assign, 1,500 words in my classes, in 10 hours, using a student-generated prompt that is completely new to me. It is never a good thing to rush an essay. Rushing is always harmful to the learning and thinking processes that humanities essays are built to encourage and hone. I do not and would never encourage a rush job. However, it is also the nature of 21st century university culture that rushing will and does happen. So it's on us professors to acknowledge that and to help you in your inevitable rushing to preserve as much of the learning and thinking as is possible, to stay sincere in your rush job rather than hacking or faking it. This is the prompt that students of mine generated for me when I asked them to do so a day before the experiment on Discord. I asked them to do it by a certain time to make sure that I had no experience of the prompt before opening it up. And they gave me, Joyce uses the Arab culture, Oriental view, to show the corruption of religion and society. Is there significance of specifically using an Oriental culture to show this corruption? Is there a connection to colonialism in Joyce's portrayal? And define Orientalism was added to that prompt. So this is a prompt that I discovered right at the beginning of the essay, and this is what I had to work with. And I think, and they are specifically referring to Joyce's short story, Araby. That's also at the website. So stage one in that process for me is close reading, research, hypothesis, testing, hypothesis and testing of the hypothesis, and early broad drafting well past the word limit. That's what I'm aiming for here. And I should say here that they give a lot of choices on the student Discord, but the one that they seem to like most is the one that I chose. Also, that at the beginning of this essay, I had never read or heard of Joyce's short story, Araby. I'm a medievalist by trade, and so I had never had the occasion and joy of reading Joyce's Araby. You'll see what I'm doing here, and I have put this 7-hour process at 20 times the speed so I can narrate it easily. I've set a timer there. I have downloaded and purchased, for the purpose of the assignment, a student edition, a broad view edition of Araby. And here's me reading it for the first time. You'll notice that just now I have started music. When I need to work fast, I play video game music. It gets me in the headspace to do hyper-focused and sometimes repetitive action. So here's me reading through Araby. If you see me bumping back and forth as I read, it's because I am looking at the footnotes as I go, and also I'm allowing myself to drift a bit as I read. I'm going back and forth to look at the prompt. I'm trying here as I read also to get a brief sense of what people have said about Orientalism and Araby before. Because again, I have no experience of this prior. At this point, I've finished reading the short story for the first time, and now I'm doing the process of just looking through and getting to know what the discourse around Orientalism and Araby is. And so I'm poking around lightly through secondary sources. I'm looking at footnotes here again, and then I've realized that I haven't even taken a class on this. I've actually never studied James Joyce's work at the university level, ever. And so I'm looking through possible additions, and I spent some time there looking closely at the introduction to the Broadview edition to give me a sense of the basic assumptions that the prompt takes as assumed. You'll see now I'm mining the Broadview introduction for quotable things that I might need to refer to when I finally get to the essay writing stage, just to make sure that I have a sense of what's necessary. I've also poked around an early edition of Araby in its original context in Dubliners, which I spent some time looking at just to establish whether there's any significant difference. I start to close read at this point. I'm close reading now at about 32 minutes into the process. Again, this is the first time. And I'm starting to generate from my close reading just things that have taken my attention. I'm noticing that I, of course, have to be knowledgeable about the British Empire at the time of Joyce and how it worked in the Arab world, which is something, again, I'm completely new to. So here I consult the Encyclopedia Britannica just to give myself some context, and I'm noting some of the wording and some of the confusion that I had in close reading. Right, so I'm taking note of those, and I'm referring to the OED here to figure out what the aunt means when she says you might have to put off. So I'm curious about what put off means. I'm wondering if there's something in that. I'm trying to figure out why the narrator needs his uncle to be home, to go out in the first place in Araby. It took me a while, and in that figuring, I did a close reading, right? I used my close reading to figure through. You see, we're at timestamp 52 already. So anyway, in so doing, I've started to develop the beginnings of a hypothesis, but now I'm using the jumping from close reading to research and back. This is a good way to stimulate innovative thinking by formulating your initial hypothesis in relation to reading that you've done. Here I'm looking at Bazaar, figuring out what that means, how Ehrlich, who is the source that I've attached myself to here, Ehrlich seems to be a good source. I've poked through sources and found this one through a search on the, I think it was the MLA bibliography for this one. And I'm starting to formulate thoughts and to take quotes from the Ehrlich using the close reading. The close reading, I keep trying to figure out why the narrator couldn't go out. I figured that out, and now I'm trying to use that reading in connection with the Ehrlich to see if it sparks any hypotheses in me. But again, you'll see I haven't laid down a hypothesis or let alone a thesis statement yet until just now. I keep noticing gender as I read. One thing I notice when I'm reading the Ehrlich, particularly, right, the silver bracelet, right? So, right, I'm noticing in Ehrlich here, you see I'm typing it as I think, and I'm hypothesizing inherent to Joyce in Orientalism is repeated characterization of the desired and withheld object of Orientalism as a young girl or woman. And I'm specifically focusing, you'll see below, on the silver bracelet that she's wearing. I start to formulate this is what I'm doing now, is sort of a free write, just laying down ideas, right, for what that means. How then can I focus this prompt? This prompt, by the way, right, and I'm now typing out how I can destabilize the Ehrlich, right? The Ehrlich seems to also, in this reading, assume a gender relation that the Ehrlich doesn't question, but rather takes as a given, a way of understanding gender in relation to Orientalism that isn't questioned, but that's taken as a given. I'm trying to destabilize that because one of the things that struck me in my reading is how when I first read the image of the Mengen's sister character wrapping a chain around and around her wrist, I immediately thought of slavery. And when I saw the Ehrlich seem to treat the objectification of women or girls as a given thing. Here I'm looking up convent, by the way. I noticed that one of the things that makes her feel confined to me is that she says she's in a convent, but the Broadview edition quickly glosses convent as a convent school, that is an all-girls school in Ireland. But I feel weird about that, right? Because I know convent prompts for me thinking of a nunnery. And I look up in the OAD to see that it does indeed also mean that. So I'm looking for other uses by Joyce that might support that. And I find that in the same story collection, in the story Clay, he does use convent as a freestanding word to mean the kind of convent that nuns go to, meaning that Joyce at least does recognize the usage of convent on its own as meaning nunnery, which means that while we're clearly denotating, we're here at timestamp 149, we're clearly denotating, this is the lunch break I took, we're clearly denotating the idea, or denoting the idea that the girl is at an all-girls school. There's a connotation here that she's in a nunnery. That paired with this image I can't get out of my head about her wrapping herself in a chain and how that's deployed with respect to Ehrlich starts to allow my hypothesis to take form. This is my lunch break right now. I'm making sure in my process to take time to go eat, to take care of my body. That's really inherent to process. It was a short lunch break, but I did take it. While me and the recording is on a lunch break, let me also relate that one of the things I discovered in the Ehrlich was what I perceived to be Ehrlich's sort of institutional sexism because of the way he treated two different sources, one male, one female, without acknowledging that there's a gender differentiation. I realized later as I returned to the Ehrlich that I had misread it. Actually, both of the sources that he was referring to were male. So I had to leave that behind, but on that misreading, my hypothesis got formed. You'll see now I'm searching through JSTOR to find any mention at all. Now that I'm into that bracelet, because it's on the wrapping of the bracelet that seems to be, to me, where my close reading is inherent, right? The wrapping of the bracelet as a sign of how the Mengen sister relates to Orientalism and relates to objectification and to sexuality. So I'm looking through as many sources as I can find, or rather I found, right, a nice number of like 7 sources through JSTOR, each of which has a different perspective on what the bracelet is. So I'm just situating myself with respect to that. You'll notice I haven't done that much writing or drafting yet, and we're well into the process. So I'm looking at now, and now I've noticed that he uses the word veil, right? And I'm also noticing things that seem to identify the girl with a kind of stereotypical Orientalist vision of the kept woman. And so I look up Joyce through JSTOR, I think. I look up Joyce and harem symbolism, and I find an article by and I've now jumped ahead. Sorry, it's hard to keep up with this. I found an article by Schloss about Joyce's Orientalism and its objectification in women. And here we go. Hypothesis. It is well known that for James Joyce, or rather James Joyce's attempt to connect Irish culture with Arab culture are well known. Part of that connection is his use of British colonial suppression. But Joyce's Orientalism here, in trying to establish kinship or equivalent with others who are colonized, is still Orientalism, treating the other as a broad and interchangeable representation of oppression. Since Joyce's complaints about the oppression so frequently centered on sexual repression, right, I need to connect it to the prompt here. But Schloss, right, I'm talking about Schloss, looking at Schloss, noticing that the skirt dancing might be a thing involving veiling. Here we're at 241. So now I have an idea about the skirt dancing. Sorry, it's hard to keep up with my own notes. Basically, to summarize what I'm doing here, I'm again free writing an idea of what I could hypothesize, and I'm noticing that the reason that, as I read, that chain stuck out to me is because it really felt like the narrator was not only objectifying, but turned on by the sort of implicit confinement of his love interest, right? I've been prompted, and I'm returning to the prompt again and again here. I've been prompted to talk about how Joyce deploys Orientalism in Araby as a way of critiquing religion. Oh, and I found the Kana now as right. So I had found this Ranjana Kana now when I was searching for sources on the bracelet. And we'll find later that the Kana turns out to be the key text for my approach. But anyway, I noticed that the bracelet was where, for me, in my reading, I really noticed this enslavement imagery, which turns on its head a lot of what I had been reading in the Ehrlich, and even in the Kana, which is a feminist approach, about what we assume about how Joyce uses Orientalism to critique the Catholic sexual mores, or to push for sexual liberation. Right? I know from my reading the Broadview anthology, and this is me now getting to know the Kana really well. Right, I'm taking the time to get into the Kana really well. We're almost at the halfway mark. I haven't written that much, right? But my purpose is to really get to know my text, and this one seems to really speak to the prompt in a way that I can understand. And this one discusses the bracelet, but reads the bracelet in a way that I disagree with, right? This one reads the bracelet, which is how I found it on JSTOR. The Kana reads the bracelet as a sign of the girl's commercialism, or the girl's consumerism. The girl also wants to consume Araby. But it struck me that in this colonialist construction, or in this Orientalist construction, it's also the girl gets framed herself as a kind of harem girl, which is a term I get from the Schloss, which I've also looked at. So you see, I've made a note to myself that this is my initial hit on the Schloss and the Kana, right? I've written to myself, got to read the Schloss and the Kana, and then get writing. I'm prompting myself. I'm halfway through my 7 hours to get drafting already. I've only hypothesized and free written at this point. So I'm mining. Here I'm mining the Schloss and the Kana, first the Kana, then the Schloss, for quotes that seem, or quotations that seem to be particularly apt. I'm giving them also a good read, because I suspect that they're going to be my strongest sources. Now I'm writing out in James Joyce's Araby, when the narrator finally gets his long, oops, I've made a note. Okay, giving myself a little time to make a note. Oh, here we go. I'm looking, I got distracted, or not distracted, I noticed, I'm also giving myself a heading here. I have named the student Poop90, who came up with this Professor Poop, and now I have a title, a hypothetical title, Mengen Sisters Bracelet, Sexist Orientalism in Joyce's Araby, and I'm starting to write here. And I'm starting to write here because I've hypothesized that where I'm going to go is I'm going to formulate my hypothesis off of Kana particularly, and Schloss and their idea of Orientalism, because that's the one that speaks to me most. But because Schloss only reads Ulysses and Kana reads the bracelet differently than I would, I'm seeing whether there's anything in the fact that the bracelet has something. So here I am now, whether there's something to the bracelet that might, or rather, I'm noticing that there's something in the bracelet that that makes me think of confinement that Kana seems to miss. But now what I'm doing is I'm creating this long, like this is just sort of my process here. Right now I'm just sort of collecting everything everybody said about the bracelet so far. And you'll see here I'm citing and citing and citing. Now these texts that I cite really quickly, I haven't read through completely. I found on JSTOR just the parts that are relevant. And that's only the parts that I use, right? This is not me misusing sources, I don't think. This is me simply in rushing, finding and reminding myself what people have said about the bracelet so far. Right, I'm not reading the parts of their articles that are not relevant to the bracelet, and I don't rely on them in any way. It's the Kana and the Schloss and the Ehrlich that I've read in depth for this. So I start to formulate the beginning of an introduction, just to get my head in the right place, to see whether I can formulate, right, the hypothesis in a longer form of an essay, right? And I start to try to word how I want to process the Kana. I noticed that she says in one of her notes, when I was reading quickly, she makes a comment on how overinterpreted the girl is. Here's me looking through and applying my various kana notes. So you see me sort of starting to change my wording only, right? You notice I changed the word mythic to grand there for a second. Here, let's see what formulates here. So the way that Joyce equates, Joyce is not subtle, right? So I'm trying to establish through the kana and through the other readings what is given and assumed at the back of the prompt, as opposed to what I'm arguing. I'm using the trick, or not the trick. I'm using the process for innovation of positioning myself against what's already been said, right? So I'm trying to articulate what the given circumstances are, what is given from my previous critical reading, against which I'm formulating my hypothesis. And again, the hypothesis that's taken form here, and that took form about halfway through the 7 hours, right? Notice I looked back at the prompt, I realized I needed to make sure that it's super clear why my hypothesis is relevant to the critique of religion that the prompt asked for. So I'm making sure that it's really clear in my wording that the critique of religion I'm talking about is a critique of sexual mores and sexual customs drawn from Catholicism, which I got from the Broadview Edition's introduction. So I've reworded my title for there. Anyway, I keep getting sidetracked by, it's just hard to keep up with this. But anyway, I have registered that it is, right, I've chosen one specific thing, that is the bracelet, to focus on, because in my reading, right, I've noticed that that not only does she touch the bracelet, as Kana has said, but she is continually wrapping it around her wrist again and again. And through my close readings, I noticed that that's alongside a lot of adjacent images that connote or suggest enslavement or imprisonment, right? I'm looking around through secondary sources and seeing nobody has said anything about that. But when I read, the bracelet struck me first as a kind of shackle. I tried to figure out why, and I noticed that there are multiple, and I took notes on each of these, multiple examples of things that connote or suggest enslavement to me. And now I'm trying to follow through on them, right? I'm returning to the text again and again to continue my close reading during the process of reading, to return to the text. I'm also looking at the quotations that I have already harvested from my 2 main sources. I've started to let the Ehrlich fall away, even though I really enjoyed reading the Ehrlich and got a lot from it. But here I'm saying, I argue that in Araby, Joyce constructs the anti-religious ideal of sexual liberation by turning to Orientalism. But when it does so not only by, whoops, we cut away there, right? I'm looking again at the kana, not only by framing women's bodies as taking the kana as the colonized space within the colony, right? Here I'm clearly building off of kana, right? But also by articulating heterosexual desire as fundamentally, dependent fundamentally on the constriction of women's bodies. And we see here there's a sort of complex hypothesis that has taken form. That hypothesis really began to take form halfway through. Now it's really gotten through the kana. It's gotten its fuller articulation here. So by articulating Irish sexual liberation, oh no, I'm gone back up. Right now, again, this is just how I work on the essay, right? You'll see I bounce back and forth, and as ideas occur to me, I go up and down and up and down. You'll see also I already have had to kill a darling. I was really interested in notating and cataloging all of the different readings of the bracelet, but I had to cut it and move it to a footnote because there just wasn't any room for it, all right? Here I'm trying to re-articulate again to make really, really clear what I'm building off of. Here I am taking, again, that catalog of different readings and putting it into a note. Let's see. Okay, I'm continuing to look through my sources. This is one of the hardest stages, I think, to try to take what I have gotten from the kana and synthesize it into my response to the kana, so that I can formulate my hypothesis, but to do so without reducing kana's argument, right? That requires me to continually return to my source text. You'll see there are other source texts that I didn't have as much use for, that I decided not as much to use, right? And here I am also making sure to keep my notes relatively tight, though not perfect, because I don't know what I'm going to keep. Trying to establish again in my introduction what it is I'm taking for granted and what it is I'm not. I'm noticing that the connection between critique of the Catholic Church and Orientalist images are actually next to each other in the broad view, so I'm noticing that. And I am again re-articulating my idea of the kana here. You'll see I'm only really polishing the introduction over and over again, right? I'm almost done with my sandbox stage, but I'm focusing so much on my introduction because it is the space where I articulate my hypothesis, I articulate my ideas, I'm working through my argument, right? That's the only part that I'm polishing the precision of. In the notes below, I've been continually free writing and developing my ideas, developing a sort of rough structure for where I'm going, right? But I'm focusing on the wording of the introduction so that I can understand my logic. And now I have realized I have to sort of focus. So I have made a little from here note to myself. Where am I going from here? And I have zoomed in on, I want to talk about the word veil in the scene. And I want to talk about the imagery, right? So you'll see from here, I'm going to talk about veil. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the veil. I will end up cutting a lot of this. A lot of time talking about the veil, and a lot of time dealing with the images that struck me of confinement. Right. So we're bouncing back and forth, and here I am trying to think through all three sources: the Joyce, the Kana, and the Schloss. Right. And here I am. This is my section that I'm guessing at the sequestering of women, about the point about the convent, which turns out to be relevant. So when I put the convent together with the fence, I had to look up railing to be sure. I noticed that both Schloss and Kana have referenced Scheherazade, so I took a moment there to look up and remind myself who Scheherazade was. And then I'm continually, right, now I've realized this is how the Schloss works. The Schloss makes the most sense in my first paragraph on the veil, at least as I currently think about the essay. So now I'm starting to articulate my first, the first paragraph of the essay itself after what will be the thesis statement, was currently the hypothesis. Right, so I'm just trying to argue, I'm trying to establish through Schloss what I've learned from the Schloss that's relevant to my essay, which is the way that Irish Orientalism, specifically in Joyce's Ulysses, establishes Orientalism as a place of sexual liberation in contrast to the Catholic Church. So that speaks really, really closely to the prompt, right? And I make sure to word it as such. Here I'm mining the Schloss. I'm noticing this perfect place to discuss the skirt dancing idea that I had. I will go back and forth about whether I can fit the skirt dancing. In the end, I'll have to figure it out. And here I'm making sure to make sure that I thoroughly understand the Schloss. One thing I continually make sure of is I return to the secondary sources I'm citing to make sure I really understand in a deep way what they're saying, because I don't want to be reductive. And so here you'll see I'm taking time to note that the exoticization of Westerners in Joyce's period is not actually true to what the experience, or the exoticization by Westerners of Arab people is not true to what the actual experience of Arab women was, right? So making sure that that's clear. And then I'm bringing it to bear on my close reading, right? So Schloss has said this much, but she doesn't talk about Araby, right? But here Schloss establishes that the veil is one of the clearest signifiers of Western exoticization of Arab women. Westerners then and now totally misunderstand how veils work in Arab culture. And so, as I notice at the Araby in Dublin event in 1894, veiling women, at least as skirt dancing, which I looked up in the OED, involves drapery of all kinds, is one major signifier of, right? And I'm noticing here that I'm a signifier of Orientalism. So I'm noticing here that I'm tight on time in my sandbox period, and I still have not fully drafted. You'll see that I actually don't get to the end of the draft. And I'm noticing also that my word count is reaching its limit, right? I have a big quote from Schloss that I really want to use. I realize now that I won't be able to include all of it, but the Schloss talks about how one of the ways in which Westerners envisioned the objectification and exoticization of Arab women is by sequestering women, by putting them in the harem, right? And how this convent point that I noticed when I was reading, how I perceive the word convent and its connotations as referring to a sequestering. Here I'm looking up railing to make sure I've understood that word correctly. Right, also led to the reason, and this is at 7 minutes. That's 7 hours. That's what I got, 7 hours. I've broadly drafted. Now I'm going to reassess my logic and focus. I'm going to return to my key texts, rework the intro, and move to completion, killing my darlings. So importantly, when I set out to do this experiment, I was hoping to do a much quicker job in order to I was thinking I might do a quicker job in order to demonstrate what rushing is. But I discovered that the amount of time that this took was really a solid 10 hours at minimum. So I allowed that time and I went back for a 2-hour editing stage. The value of returning later cannot be understated. You'll notice, by the way, I listen to music. Again, as I've done this, here I'm listening to the soundtrack from Undertale. right? And I'm looking through what I've written, and I notice need to fix my logic and focus here, right? So I'm now breaking down I'm doing the 3/4 through the process, outlining, of figuring out the logic more clearly of what it is I'm arguing. I've noticed that I could put my point about veiling and my point about other imagery and the convent in any order. So why is it that they're in the order they are? I notice that what I'm really trying to get at here, right, my interaction with the kana is that I'm trying to figure out what she is, or rather how she uses what I feel to be her incomplete reading of the necklace, right? So I feel like Kana is reading the necklace incompletely, and I otherwise find her argument compelling. So I'm noticing that there are the parts of her argument that rely on the incomplete reading of the necklace. That's what I can contribute. I can deepen and somewhat disagree with mainly deepen and destabilize the kana by drawing attention to the necklace and to the images of enslavement that it implies. So here I'm writing it down as a logical proof, right? I'm breaking down what I've argued so far and what I suspect and what I hypothesize in a stronger logical proof. If kana says this, but if the bracelet is this in the text, so if one thing and if one thing, then I can conclude this. That requires me to really dig into the kana. The kana is a really, really complicated text. So I'm taking the time again here to return to the kana, to read the relevant parts of the kana in even more depth, to make sure that I thoroughly understand it. And you'll see that 30 minutes for this have already elapsed. Right, I'm noticing that Kana is also really using the Scheherazade, and that seems. And then I'm noticing I'm also close reading Kana. You'll see I've discovered in my close reading Kana that she characterizes Mengen's sister as wanting a gift, and I'm remembering from my multiple returns through my eyes to the Joyce that she never actually asks for it. So that feels like a good jumping off point. That Kana is attributing to Mengen's sister an agency that Joyce doesn't seem to allow her. Here again, I've returned to the quote or to the prompt, and I'm trying to make sure that it's really clearly tied to the prompt. But you'll see, I'm still sort of like playing with my wording, making sure that the wording means what I'm gets at my thinking through. With only an hour and 15 in my editing stage to go, right? And so here I'm noticing that one of the things I need to do is to really articulate clearly what I take for granted. So I've added this line about what we can take as quote-unquote obvious, that's Kana's word, about how Joyce deploys Orientalism, so that I can build my more nuanced reading of the bracelet upon that taken for granted. I can innovate above that. Right. So now I am positioning positioning what is becoming my thesis in relation to Kana, responding to Kana, who takes that consumerism as Mengen's sister's desire to colonize vicariously. I will point out that she is also made an object herself by the bracelet that is supposedly a sign of her consumerism. And so I start to work through what it is I'm thinking. Now again, I have all of the material from my sandbox period for this argument already laid out, right? Already thought through. It's just in an unformed form. Right, and so now I have to take the material and start to cut things and move things into place to make sense out of them. Right, I have added here to the veil reading. I've now reminded myself what my professors' names are. It's both LQC and Poop, so I've named them professors LQC and Poop. And I'm looking through my notes here. Now you'll see, I'm trying to find the Oxford English Dictionary, and in the interim, the University of Toronto Library site changed, so I had to get a little doing to get back the entry on convent that I had found, the entry on railing that I had found, making sure that I cite why I think the railings mean what they mean. You'll see I've also noticed in returning to the text again that the veiling scene is paired with characterizing something that also struck me as I read, characterizing Mengen's sister as brown in color, suggesting again that she is kind of a harem girl in the boy narrator's fantasy. So now I get into the depth of the close reading of the scene itself, right? The reason it needs to go in the order it does is because I'm arguing that the veil, that the presence of the veil alongside the initial sort of brown facing of Mengen's sister establishes a frame of Orientalist West Irish Orientalist fascination with with harems and with veiled women as objects. In short, the Western perception that Arab men enjoyed sensual delights by sequestering and oppressing women was precisely what, in the Joycean exoticization of the Arab world, made Arab sex seem so free, having furtively imagined desire as a pulling back of any desire to veil. The narrator meets Mangan's brown sister as she complains about her confinement in a sequestered space for women, right? You see how it starts to come together. And so there, right, I'm making sure to have an articulation of all of the close reading I've done. You'll notice, too, I had initially planned to discuss the kana and then the close reading, but I've realized that establishing the close reading after the introduction makes the most sense, because it makes clear why I'm responding to the kana in the way I am and why it is lacking in the kana not to, right? Compelling as it is, Kana's reading of Irish Orientalism in Araby assumes here that the boy and his crush share equally in the Irish modernist urge to reclaim and reimagine a symbolic future, right? So I've gotten that from my really close reading of the Kana. So here, with only 7 minutes left in the revision or editing stage, I'm really articulating, right? Articulating the sort of coming together of my argument. And what it is, in the end, is my argument takes the shape of finding that the thing that struck me most as I read Araby is not really addressed in the Kana. And so I'm bringing my reading in the Kana, which strikes similar chords, and so I'm bringing my reading into contact with the Kana. I've gone a little over 2 hours, so I'm just finishing it up here, and saving it, and there we go. Stage 3, proof and polish, just an hour. Edit for clarity and precision, clean up notes and citation, proofread for tone by reading aloud. So, just to reflect on what we've done so far, you'll see that in 9 hours I have produced something that I could theoretically submit in its form, but I wanted to make sure to take up, right, it's messy, you'll see it's messy, but I want to make sure to put it through 1 more hour of proofing and polishing to make sure that it's clear, that it's precise, that my notes are cleaned up. I realized I left off a works cited page, so anyway, here we go. All right, this is me going bit by bit through every sentence that I have written. Again, you'll see I've cut a lot, moved it to the notes. I'm looking at word by word whether the sentences flow together. I'm remembering works cited page, right? So you'll see here, right, I'm looking closely. I'm noticing that I'm cutting the Irish Catholic. I think that's over. I gotta catch up with my own writing here. I'm also looking to shave off words because my word count at this point is 1,600, which is too high, a bit too high. Though again, I'm not enforcing word count with crazy. I'm assuming my professor isn't doing that either. And I'm just taking a close look at how I cite things. I'm noticing I left out the citation of skirt dancing from the OED, so I'm adding that back in. Let's see, what else do I do here? Right, I had a little trouble with the clock there. All right, so here I am reading what seems like quickly, but it's actually relatively slowly, word per word, making sure that I am saying what I actually mean to say, right? You'll see there I made a small change in making clear that Schloss is talking about Ulysses, but I'm talking about Araby. And here I'm rewording my discussion of the Kana to make sure that it doesn't seem like I'm trying to undermine the Kana, but rather that I'm deepening, right? So I change compelling as it is, I change it to convincing as it otherwise is. I'm noticing that my close reading gives me a little more than I've allowed here, and since I've shaved off some pages, I needed to put a little more wording around why the boy's desire is like the desire of the Englishman that he witnesses in the empty bazaar when he gets there. I'm checking through all my citations here, right? And now I'm forming out of my endnotes, which were used to be footnotes, but I'm forming out of my endnotes some clean citations for the works cited page, making sure that I got the electronic edition cited properly. I'm using the citation format that I'm used to, and now I'm simply reading aloud. Right, and as I read aloud, I'm making micro changes about the wording, right? As I read aloud and I think, oh, that wording could be misunderstood, and I'm making a change. I'm trying it this way, trying it that. I'm checking here for tone, right? Making sure I added a quickly there. I've deleted some over-explaining, and I've taken the opportunity to flesh out my ending, my conclusion, to do it more justice, and that's it. And here's the beginning of what I came up with. So I have my heading, Matthew Sergi, English 281. I took the time to make sure I got my professors' names correctly. You don't know how many times I've had my own name misspelled in a paper submitted to me. That is always a tonal misstep. Date and prompt, and then the title, Mangan's Sister's Bracelet, Sexist Orientalism and Sexual Rebellion in James Joyce's Araby. Not only do I make my subject and methodology thoroughly clear in my title, but I also make extra clear what its connection is to the prompt. When the boy protagonist in James Joyce's Araby finally gets the chance to speak to his crush, Mangan's sister, he notices her jewelry first. While she spoke, she turned a silver bracelet round and round her wrist. Footnote. Critics have attributed a range of biblical or chivalric significances to that bracelet. Footnote. Or endnote. Ranjanakana, having observed that Mangan's sister, quote, becomes representative of anything the critic wishes to highlight, end quote, suggests that the nameless young woman is such a broadly interpretable symbol because, quote, in many literatures of decolonization, among which she includes Araby, woman gets figured as nation in the emerging national consciousness, end note with citation. Joyce's story, quote, very obviously, to borrow Khanna's wording, equates Irish Orientalism with a boyish desire for sex with a young woman, a desire that, in the story's final scene in the nearly empty bazaar, brings only disillusionment and emasculated frustration because the would-be colonist, being Irish, is already colonized. End note, establishing what the given circumstances are that I am trying to innovate above. I cannot, in the space of this short essay, thoroughly examine how Joyce uses Irish Orientalism in Araby to critique his country's, quote, blind allegiance to the church and its rigid adherence to social mores. Again, that's reference to the prompt drawn from the Broadview Anthology introduction. One such critique is evident, notice the repetition of critique to make clear the clarity of the sentence. One such critique is evident in the fact that the boy's sexual desires, expressed as his yearning to get to Araby, are delayed by forgetful, pious adults that keep him in the musty house of a dead priest until it is too late. End note, citation. I will, however, offer a close reading of the bracelet, a key symbol in Joyce's critique, making clear what my thesis is at this point before the end of the first page. I will, however, offer a close reading of the bracelet, a key symbol in Joyce's critique, which appears alongside suggestive images. I had said powerfully suggestive. I cut the powerfully in the final proofing because it was overstating. Alongside suggestive images, and it wasn't really what I meant, right? Which appears alongside suggestive images of imprisonment and confinement, making it feel as much like a shackle as it does a symbol of, as Khanna argues, Irish women's consumerism. There I establish myself in relation to Khanna. In response to Khanna, who finds in that consumerism Mangan's sister's desire to colonize vicariously through the boy's gift, I counter that the bracelet also frames Mangan's sister as a gift, that the Orientalism of Araby, when it calls for sexual freedom against religion, again referencing the prompt there, envisions a liberation of male desire that idealizes the confinement of women. And then I go into the Schloss from there, and you can see the rest of that essay in its fullness linked at the page in which this lecture is embedded. I hope that was useful. Again, I'm not encouraging rushing in any way through this experiment. I'm only acknowledging that rushing is often what has to happen. And so I'm encouraging you, if and when you do rush an essay and get it done in the space of too few hours to do thinking that are ideal for the thinking of the depth required for an essay of this length. I hope that you do it in a sincere way that allows for the play of thoughts, that gives you time to think through before you commit to any thesis, before you start writing, that allows a lot of time in the sandbox to make sure that what you're saying really does do some justice to the readings that you've done. And in doing that justice, then make sure that you get some deep and complex thinking done in relation to the literature that you're working through.